I would encourage everybody to open up to Leviticus chapter 25. While you're doing that, allow me to briefly apologize to the people sitting in the front row. I always hate that I just spring it on them when I just kind of show up here in this front and kind of speak from the Bible class area. But there are some sermons that I think it demands that kind of intimacy, and this is certainly one of them this morning. This is, as I mentioned in the Bible class this morning and on our readings this week, that's a sermon that's been on my heart for quite a while. I've wanted to kind of explore it and look at it. And it's really not a controversial subject. It's just something that requires a lot of thought because it's A, something we don't talk a lot about, but B, can be encouraging as long as we look at it the right way, and that's certainly the way that I want to look at it this morning. It's no secret that the last 18 months have been contentious, to say the least. I don't think there's any one of us that hasn't been touched by the events of the last 18 months with the pandemic, with COVID, with all the things that is happening. People's entire lives have been uprooted. People's ways of looking at the world has been uprooted in a whole lot of ways, and so there's been a lot of people that have been forced to re-examine things. And that's just in kind of the secular world. Religiously, churches really haven't dealt with it that well. There's been churches that I know of that have split right down the middle because of responses to vaccines, responses to masks, responses to all these different things, and that's not something that we haven't felt here as well. There have been no shortage of hurt feelings both ways. There have been no shortage of apologies that are both ways. And so this is a time where it's been really tense. It's been really contentious, where a lot of people seem like they're going back and forth. And I'm not here to touch necessarily on any of those things, but to present hopefully an opportunity that will allow us to heal just a little bit. What if instead of the last 18 months just kind of being this dark kind of shadow that hangs over our lives, and for some people that will be the way we look at it, 20, 30, 40 years from now, we look back at this as a time period that we just needed to get through, where we just kind of, had relationships that were stressed, our faith was maybe stressed, and we just kind of got through it. What if instead of that, we used it as an opportunity to heal? Talking about the Jubilee year that is named there in Leviticus chapter 25, and I want to make something very plain before we go into this sermon. I do not believe by any stretch of the imagination that a Jubilee year is something that is New Testament authorized. I don't think that we should be doing it in the New Testament. It's certainly not a command, and I'm not here to make it a command. But what I do think is important is that there are lots of concepts that are inside of the Jubilee year that, as I thought about the last 18 months, just seem to spill right over, many of which we'll talk about here this morning. When you look, for instance, at Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 8, he says here, this is just kind of the Levitical way to kind of the logistical way to do this. He says, talking to the Israelites, you are to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 Sabbaths. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, and on the day of atonement you shall sound a horn all throughout your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th years of Jubilee. You shall not sow, nor shall you reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines, for it is a Jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. To my knowledge, I've never really mentioned the word Jubilee year in any sermon, at least in recent memory. My memory is about the size of that of a fly. I don't remember even really what I had for breakfast, or even if I had breakfast, so I don't remember talking about this subject. But the more I think about the Jubilee year, the more I see over and over again the principles that are in play in today's world. And the key idea here in Leviticus chapter 25, if we get nothing else out of this section, is that word release. The idea of the Jubilee year is that it's a release. It's a release from bondage. It's a release from debts. It's a release from the land. Everything is released. Everything reverts back more or less to its original form. You can see this in the verses that follow immediately afterwards. In verse 13, he says, on this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell you according to the number of the years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years, you shall increase the price, and in proportion to the fewness of the years, you shall diminish its price, for it is a number of crops that he is selling to you. So you, verse 17, shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord, your God. The whole point of the year of Jubilee was to release land and debts and slaves, all these things, back to what is essentially their original form. And so, in considering the fact that the land was divided out in Joshua according to their own genealogies, according to their own people, every 50 years, no matter matter how much land you bought, how much you acquired, it all went back to that original family that it was given to in the first place. The same is true of debts. If you had a debt that was owed or somebody owed you a debt, you kind of diminish that price and then you release it. Everything goes back to the way it was. And it's a pretty monumental undertaking. And I actually wondered how often they kept the year of Jubilee, and I couldn't find anybody that would tell me straight up, just even if the Jews celebrated this. And what I think that speaks to is, number one, a lack of devotion to the idea in the first place, but also speaks to just how incredibly impactful this year would have been. Everything reverts back to its original form. But it really wasn't just about release. There are a few principles, and we'll move through these very briefly as we move on, the real meat, more or less, of the sermon. But there are some principles that I think you see at play here in these verses. For instance, in verse 23, it very plainly states that the land is God's. You may own the land, you may lease the land, you may work the land, but the land itself is God's. God owns everything. He is over everything. He's in charge of everything. And so everything belongs to God. He also mentions there in verse 55 that the people are God's. It's not just enough to have the people that kind of work for you and work around you and work with you, but those things are also God's as well. He also mentions there in verse 19 that the security is God's. And that's something we'll really touch on here as we get towards the end of the sermon, but just the amount of faith that would have been required to actually go forth with the Jubilee year. It's not something that you just kind of have willy-nilly. It's not something you just kind of do at the last minute. It is something that requires a lot of faith. And so what they need to understand going into that year of Jubilee is that God will protect me. My security is in God's hands. The land is God's, the people are God's, and my security is God's. And those are things that we have a real hard time coming to grips with, all three of these. Because we tend to think that if I work and I make some money and I buy this land, that that's mine. I own this little patch of earth. And legally you might. But we know that everything that's under the sun and everything above the sun ultimately is God's. He gives it to us for a short time. He lets us work it. He lets us enjoy it. But everything that's on this earth comes to God. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably sitting there wondering, what does any of this Jubilee year have to do with us? Why are we talking about the idea of a Jubilee year? Because as we stated, nothing about this is taught from the New Testament. But what I do want to challenge you this morning with, not this evening, I don't know why I would even say that, but what I do want to challenge you with this morning is not to, as we mentioned a second ago, look at the last 18 months and however many months in the future we're dealing with this, not look at this as a time of darkness. Not look at it a time where people were at each other's throats. Not look at it a time where you just deactivated your Facebook account and came back after everything was over. That's not what we should look at it as. Maybe there's something that we can gain from this. You know, when you think about what a Jubilee year was, it was really an interesting time period because depending on which side you were, it could either be the greatest year of your life or it could be one of the most challenging. If you were somebody who basically had to sell off all your land over the previous years to pay ends meet, or you had a debt that was just crippling, the year of Jubilee was something you looked forward to because you could essentially have all of that reset and everything was fine, everything reverted back to normal. On the other hand, if you were somebody who generationally had accumulated quite a bit of wealth, you had debts that were incoming, you had land that you were in charge of, that requires quite a bit of sacrifice. To then say, I'm going to let all this go back to originally where it came from in the first place. And depending on where you are in today's world, you can either look at this as a time that we're growing, or you can look at it as a monumental sacrifice. But what I'm telling you is that if we let this time period, if the people in the time of the Jubilee year let it happen, there's quite a bit to gain from it. The Jubilee year was not meant to be anything that crippled people. It was not meant to be anything that people look back and said, I can't believe we had to go through that. It was a time period that they gained quite a bit of things. And I would argue that we can gain quite a bit in today's world as well, starting with, first and foremost, the fact that we can essentially take a long period of rest. You know, the word busy has almost become a byword. It's almost become a throwaway word in our culture. I guarantee if you ask 10 people how their life has been lately, at least 5 of them will say some form of the word busy. You know, I've been busy. I'm doing this. I've got this. I've got this hobby. I've got to go see that conference. I've got to work overtime. And if it's not work, it's hobbies, it's family, it's all these different things that vie for our attention. As a matter of fact, a 2019 study by H&R Block found that people reported only a half hour of free time every single day. 25% of them claimed that they regularly put off doctor's appointments because they're too busy. Now, conversely, another study found that people actually really had close to 4 hours of free time every day, but that doesn't really matter too much, because the perception that we all have is that I'm too busy to do blank. I'm too busy to take care of this. I'm too busy to take care of my health. I'm too busy to engage in these types of activities. Let me ask you a question. What did the pandemic and what did quarantine do for the last 18 months? For at least a few months there, nobody really knew how to handle ourselves. Workplaces kind of shut down. They didn't know how to handle that. Sports went off the air. Travel restrictions went in place. And so what did that force us to do? For at least a brief period of time, it forced us to sit inside our houses and stare at each other. And a lot of people looked at that as saying, oh, I just wish I could get back out there. I could get back to the grind. Other people hopefully looked at that and said, okay, how can I heal these relationships? How can we make the most of this opportunity? And that's what we have to ask ourselves this morning. We're all in this situation together, so we might as well take the rest and use it as an opportunity to grow through. Look in Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, if you would. Most of you are already there. That's the downside of putting that up on the board. Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting in verse 13. Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting in verse 13. He says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. This is a restating of the 10 Commandments, essentially, with a little bit of extra commentary from God on it. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day, listen to this, is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well with you. That sounds like a great opportunity. Verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. You know, Melina and I always joke around because every time we tell Levi to go take a nap, he kicks and screams. He fights against it. And I'm just like, if somebody told me to go take a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day, you wouldn't hear one peep out of me. But yet we do the same thing in regards to rest. We willingly work 50, 60, 70, 80 hours weeks. We willingly jam our schedules with as much as we can put in it. We willingly take on extra projects that we know we can't really do because we just crave the feeling of being busy. And I think some of that is just this kind of American concept where we're always pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and we kind of making our own way. And there is a sense in which that's great. But we cannot forget every once in a while to take a rest. And I love what is said here in Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter verse about it in verses 13 through 15, because he says you need to rest. I am commanding you Israelites, remember this is an Old Testament thing, I am commanding you Israelites to rest. Because he also says in verse 15, you will also remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord God brought you out of there by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm. Therefore you shall observe the Sabbath every single week. What is the point of the Sabbath? The point of the Sabbath wasn't just to sit back and watch college football, which I think we can all agree is a great thing that's happening this weekend. The point of the Sabbath is not to sit back and watch college football. The point of the Sabbath was not to just kind of work on those honeydew projects around the house. That wasn't the point of the Sabbath. The point of the Sabbath, at least from a religious standpoint, was to, as the psalmist says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Take a few minutes, take an hour, take several moments to think about what God has done for you. There's no secret why when the synagogue worship started right really in that intertestamental period, that it was always done on the Sabbath. People were getting together to think about God. They were getting together to study about God. Why not do it on that one day during the week when that's what we're supposed to be doing anyways? I think it's interesting if you look over at Leviticus, the 26th chapter, that the rest was deemed so important that if they didn't take it, God would take it for you. In Leviticus chapter 26, starting in verse 34. Leviticus chapter 26, starting in verse 34. It says, then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths, all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land, talking about the exile, the Babylonian and then the Assyrian exile, or flip that rather. Then the land, verse 34, will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living on it. As for those who may be left, I will also bring weakness into their hearts in the lands of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf will chase them, and even when no one is pursuing, they will flee as though from the sword, and they will fall. They will therefore Therefore stumble over each other as if running from the sword, although no one is pursuing, and you will have no strength to stand up before your enemies. But you will perish among the nations, and your enemies' land will consume you. So those of you who may be left will rot away because of their iniquity in the lands of their enemies, and also because of the iniquities of their forefathers will rot away with them. Keep in mind that what he's talking about here in this passage is this exile, this Babylonian, this Assyrian exile that will happen to them as a result of their disobedience. But notice what he says here in verse 35. If you don't take the rest, which it assumes that you didn't, there in verse 35, the land will be taken or be given a rest directly from God himself. And in case you think that this is some kind of arbitrary statement that I'm just kind of pulling something out of there, 2 Chronicles, what is it? Verse 30 or chapter 36 and verse 21 specifically states that the exile was done, at least in part, so the land could enjoy its Sabbaths. There is a sense in which we know we need to take a rest. There is a purpose behind us taking a little brief moment of time every single week, every single day, every single quarter, whatever it is, and just thinking about God. Just taking a moment to breathe. And so the Jubilee year at some point in the Old Testament was designed around this idea. And that can be the same thing that we do in today's world. We can refocus physically. We can refocus emotionally, physically, spiritually, if we just take, listen to this, some intentional time to rest. Because honestly, what we need to be doing a lot of the time is we need to be refocusing. I was hoping it wouldn't pop up the last one. We need to be refocusing. I don't know if this is just me, and maybe just me, but I assume that this is probably a pretty universal thing, that our lives are kind of like snowballs, where we get started at birth, we get started at graduation, whatever it is, and we just kind of keep trucking along. We keep moving, we keep moving, we keep moving, and before long, the snowball becomes so big that we couldn't stop it even if we wanted to. We get so caught up in doing this activity and that activity, all these different things, that we're kind of like that guy that's on the interstate that missed 3 exits, and he says, I know the next one is the way that we're supposed to take off, and it's not that one, it's the next one, it's that one, I know. And so we just kind of keep missing the exit signs that we need to have to refocus our life. Maybe once in a while what we need is a fresh perspective. And I would argue, too, that the pandemic caused that, or at least the pandemic helped with that. It forced a lot of people, and the economic world is seeing this in a lot of ways, it forced a lot of people to re-examine relationships. It forced a lot of people to re-examine their place of employment. It caused a lot of people to think where they live. And what it allowed us to do was take a step back and examine things from a wide-angle lens. All of a sudden, we're not making decisions based on what we see directly in front of us. We can kind of zoom out and we can take a little bit of a wider lens. We can make decisions based on what's actually important to us, rather than just what's right in front of us. It's hard to overstate the economic turmoil that a year of Jubilee would cause. Right now, and I don't know if it's currently a topic of debate, but at least during the campaign, there was a lot of talk about student loan forgiveness. And President Biden has talked about that in the past. And as soon as I said that, I could hear some groans. I'm not here to talk about student loan forgiveness, but I know that the student loan forgiveness is up to about $10,000 per borrower, which would create a huge impact on the economy. And people have their opinions about it one way or the other, and that's not what I'm talking about. But we all know that would create a pretty big economic impact, whether you believe it's for the better or for the worse. But imagine real quick if President Biden got up on TV and he said, not only are we going to release $10,000 of student debt, we're also going to forgive, by way of the federal government, we're going to forgive every single house mortgage. We're going to forgive every single car loan, every bit of credit card debt, every bit of emergency or every bit of medical debt, every single thing. If you've got a debt, it's gone. Now, I don't care what you think about the legality of that or whether or not that would help or hurt us, but the one thing it would do is have a monumental impact on our economy. That's what the year of Jubilee did. The year of Jubilee, if implemented correctly, wiped away all of this type of debt, the land, the slaves, all these financial debts between people, and it leveled the playing field that now all of a sudden people who used to be poor are not poor anymore because they don't have to deal with that type of stuff. People who were fantastically rich probably were still fantastically rich, but most likely dropped down a peg. And what that creates, I believe, at least a little bit, is a little bit of empathy. If you think about the early church there in Acts, the 2nd chapter, one of the things that it mentions there is that as these people began to be converted, began to remember or think about the grace that was given to them on the cross, and they had this fellowship in this community, one of the things that it says there in Acts 2, 42 through 47, is that they gave of their means, not to create a socialistic society, but they gave of their means so that nobody had lack. There's a sense of empathy that comes from that. The sense of love. There's a sense of identification. And I think you see this in the Jubilee year. Look at Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 35. Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 35. I cannot go back one page in my Bible. There it is. Leviticus 25, look in verse 35. Now, in case a countryman of yours becomes poor, and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Don't take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, so that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. I am the Lord your God, verse 38, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants. There's that God's possession of people again. For they are my servants, whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. You shall not, verse 43, rule over him with severity, but you are to revere your God. The one thing that happens when there's economic inequality, and the one thing that happens after these people begin to go so far down their path, is they begin to lose identification with other people. If one person enslaves another person, it begins to be this kind of human versus subhuman type of thing. And the one thing that God talked about all throughout Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers in regards to your dealings with other people is you can treat them according to the law, but never, ever, ever, ever forget that they are mine, number one, and that you also used to be a slave. You know, this pandemic has crippled everybody top to bottom. It's affected people from all different walks of life. It's affected people from every different corner. I was talking about this the other day when we were talking about the Black Death and Justinian's plague in the 5th century. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter what social class. It didn't matter what you did for a living. It didn't matter what you had. It affected everybody. And so arguably for one of the first times in my lifetime, I feel like I can identify with other people. And that creates a certain amount of perspective that we wouldn't maybe not have gained other people or in other ways. Are we using this time as an opportunity to refocus? Are we using this time as an opportunity to think about others, to think about what we want, to think about what's truly important? Or are we using it just as a situation to get through? Number 3, as you can see up there, I think this is a great time for us to gain some faith. I am not here to denigrate your faith. I'm not here to say that if you stand on this side of the issue or that side of the issue, that your faith is weak. I've seen a lot of that posturing amongst Christians over the last 18 months, and quite frankly, it makes me sick. There are all sorts of reasons why someone wouldn't have a strong faith. In some ways, it's very intentional. It may be because they're idolizing the things of this world. It may be because they're not surrounding themselves with God's people. It may be because they're not getting into God's Word. Those are intentional reasons. But it can also be maybe more of unintentional reasons. Maybe they're stricken by emotion. Maybe they are genuinely fearful. Maybe they see their surroundings and not the eternal. And so maybe they need to have their eyes open like the servant did in 2 Kings chapter 6, who had his eyes open to see this army of God developing around him. But the Jubilee year, if observed correctly, was an enormous test of faith. Not just because you had to rely on God for the 50th year, but because it also came after 7 years of 7 Sabbath. It actually was 2 years. And so in year 48, you got stuff together. For the next 24 months, you didn't harvest the field. You didn't till anything. You didn't buy and sell. You didn't create financial opportunities for yourself because you were too busy doing these types of things. And so what it really did at its core was test your faith. It allowed you to really dive down and see whether or not you relied on God. In Leviticus chapter 25, starting verse 18, he says, "If also after these things you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will also break down your pride of power. I will also make your sky like iron, and your earth like bronze. Your strength will be spent uselessly, for your land will not yield its produce, and the trees of the land will not yield their fruit." Do you notice what he attacked there? He attacked personal pride. Verse 21, "If then you act with hostility against me, and you're unwilling to obey me, then I will increase the plague on you 7 times according to your sins. I will let loose among you the beasts of the field, which will bereave you of your children, and destroy your cattle, and reduce your number so that your roads lie deserted." In other words, if you don't learn to rely on me, I will make you learn to rely on me. chapter 26. That's the chapter I was in. Let's go back and read chapter 25 now. Everybody's staring at me wondering. I thought I was just making a really good point. Turns out everybody was just really confused. Look in Leviticus 25, verse 18. You shall thus observe my statutes and keep my judgments so as to carry them out that you may live securely on the land. Then the land will yield its produce so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. But if you say, what are we going to eat on the 7th year if we don't sow or gather in crops? Then I will so order my blessing for you in the 6th year that will bring forth the crop for 3 years. When you are sowing the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when its crop comes in. That's that reliance on God. Now look at chapter 26, starting verse 1. The same points are being made, it's just in an extremely out-of-order way. Chapter 26 and verse 1. You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths, you shall reverence my sanctuary, I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season, so that the land which will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in the land. I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from the land, and no sword will pass through the land. But you will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. 5 of you will chase 100. 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. So I will turn towards you, make you fruitful, and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. In short, what he's saying there is perform the year of Jubilee. Have trust in me. I know that this time is stressful, he says. This year of 48 or 49 and 50. These 2 years are really going to be hard. They're going to be a test of faith. But have faith in me. Let me tell you something right now. We have a lot of people, not only in here, but in this world, that have a lot of different opinions about everything that we mentioned earlier. And your position on vaccines, on masks, on virtual services, on stimulus packages, and on everything else is not necessarily in and of itself a sign of weak or strong faith. But how you treat each other, how you treat God, and how you treat yourself, that's where the evidence of faith lies. God allows a lot of leeway between us to have differing opinions on different things, but it's how we manifest that in our lives. That's the evidence of our faith. And maybe it takes a time like we just had to remind us of that. Even though the year of Jubilee is not a New Testament concept, I think I've said that at least a dozen times so far, even though it is not a New Testament concept, maybe it is in spirit. That it forces us to prioritize and to refocus, to take some rest that we didn't know we needed, and to deepen our faith in ways we didn't know how to do on our own. And if we look at it through this lens, and this will hopefully be one of the last COVID sermons I do, by the way, in case you were getting COVID sermon weary, but if we look at it through this lens, then these last 18 months and however many more months in the future we go through, they don't have to be fruitless. Will they be hard? Yes. Will they be tension-filled? Yes. But they don't have to be fruitless. We can all come out of this stronger Christians, stronger family members, stronger people, as long as we look at it through a lens of faith. One thing we haven't talked about this morning is what you need to become a child of God. That kind of got caught in the middle of all this discussion. But let me leave anybody here without the impression that you need God, that I need God. That we need God every single hour. We need Him when we wake up. We need Him when we go to sleep. We need Him throughout the day. And the way that we at least begin that relationship with Him is with baptism. We go into the water, we wash our sins away, we come up to walk in newness of life, and we start that life of faith, or continue that life of faith, hopefully, as we move throughout the rest of our life. And if you're here this morning and for some reason that hasn't been that step for you, that you haven't taken that first step, then this is the perfect opportunity right now to do it. And we ask that you come while we stand and sing.